Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Web Platform Podcast, episode number 163. Today we're talking about RxJS. We are your hosts this week, Justin Barrow and Danny Blue. Danny, how's it going?
It's going pretty good. Ready. I love RX, so I'm very excited to talk about it.
Well, we've got some wonderful guests to help us with that this week. But before we get to introducing our guest this week, we're going to throw it over to Leon, who's going to talk about This Week in the Web in 2 minutes or less. Leon.
Thank you, Justin. So lots of wonderful things have been happening on the web this week. So first of all, Parcel, the blazing fast zero configuration web application bundler, has just published a new release, which includes tree shaking, 2 times faster watcher, and more. Gatsby, the static site generator for React, has just released a beta of their version 2. Vue.js has surpassed React in number of GitHub stars. Not that the number of GitHub stars particularly proves anything scientific, but does show how the popularity of Vue.js has grown over the years. A nice, simple, dependency-free JavaScript color picker has just been released, so if you need a modern and clean way to provide color choices to your users, I recommend you take a look at this small project. A new release of Material UI, the React components implementing Google's Material Design, has just been released, which includes a ton of improvements and component enhancements. So that's version 1.2.2, so I recommend you go and check that out. There's been a new release for Workbox, that's Workbox 3.3.0. Workbox is a collection of JavaScript libraries for building PWAs. Justin, I think you're familiar with that. And there's been, in this release, basically, there's some great new features, plenty of bug fixes, so I reckon you check that out as well. So that's everything from me for This Week in Web. Thank you, Justin.
Thanks, Leon. Interesting things going on the web this week. The platform continues to move forward. I like when the platform moves forward. It seems to be moved forward more every day. And speaking of interesting observable things, hey, we're talking about RxJS today. Let's introduce our guests, Tracy and Ben. Tracy, Ben, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
For those who don't know you, introduce yourselves. Tell us a little bit about you.
Tracy.
Sure. My name's Tracy. You can follow me on Twitter at LadyLeet. I am on the RxJS core team, Google developer expert, along with Justin, and run a consultancy called This.media, where we do cool things like pairing as a service, mentoring, et cetera, to help people with their JavaScript problems.
And my name is Ben Lesh. I am the RxJS project lead. I'm also on the Angular team at Google. I've been at Google for about a year. Prior to that, I was at Netflix for about 3 years. And I also run an Rx workshop at rxworkshop.com with Tracy.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both for coming on the show today. Ben, so if I need to get an idea greenlit at Netflix, so you've got the end, right? I can use you to get our new JavaScript show off the ground on Netflix. Is that the way we're going to do this?
Sure, we'll go with that.
I have to
a small
ask,
company, but I've never wielded that much influence, especially now that I'm not there. I don't know. We'll see.
Your presence remains.
So we're talking about RxJS. For those who don't know what RxJS is, maybe a small explainer would be a good place to start.
Sure. RxJS, the easiest way to put it is sometimes I call it Lodash for events, or Lodash for async, even though it's not just about async. The idea is it revolves around this type called an observable, which similar to a promise, but it's more of just a push-based set of values. So you can take an observable and you can manipulate it in a variety of ways. You can filter it, you can join it with other observables, you can map it into new observables, etc. But it's a fairly powerful API for dealing with events and values in a push-based way.
So can you give us a small example of, just in the browser, for example, what is a typical use case for observables that aren't already solved by something like promises?
Sure. Well, promises are really only good for single values that are always going to be asynchronous. So observables are a little bit more low level than that. in that observables can handle 0 to many values over any amount of time, including totally synchronously. So observables work really well for things like streaming data and animations, and like WebSockets would be a good example of streaming data, or user events, say click events or mouse movements or things like that. And they also work pretty well for Ajax, honestly, as well. So it's kind of the single shape that you can use to represent all sorts of different things in the front end. And you could actually even build a promise from observable. You can't go the other way around. So it depends. Observable also has some cancellation. So if you have anything you'd like to be able to cancel later, observable is a good choice for that as well.
One of the examples I always show people as far as good use cases is implementing retry logic, which can be really finicky to do, but you can actually do pretty easily with Rx.
That's right. So since observables are lazy, all you need to do to retry an observable is subscribe to it again. And there's operators that do just that. If there's an error event, it just resubscribes to the source observable, and that operator is actually just called retry, or there's a retry when that gives you a little bit of a chance to decide when you want to retry.
Yeah, and it makes doing things like exponential back off and for retry but pretty trivial, which is really, really nice. So we've said the word observable several times. I think it's important to point out that observables are not just an RxJS things. Observables are their own spec, and there's actually an observable spec to be implemented by JavaScript, correct?
Although, when is it going to be implemented? Because I think it was proposed 2015. But yes, if the observables proposal, which you can find in the TC39 repo and go root for it if you like, gets I don't know, what do we call it, merged in? If it gets merged in, then it will be just like it'll basically be a primitive in JavaScript, just like promises are.
And there are other libraries that have also implemented the same spec. So a lot of people may have. So this is RxJS. There's also RxJava, Rx Scala, Rx, you name it. So there's that same spec is even being implemented by multiple libraries as it is now. And there are other JavaScript frameworks that also implement the same spec. Correct?
That's right. So there's right down to Rx C++, Rx PHP. Rx.net is the original point from which all of these kind of all sprung. But as far as other libraries, I know that like Facebook's Relay has its own version of observable implemented with a few tweaks. There's one called Zen Observable that was put together by Kevin Smith, who was one of the original authors of the proposal. It's not as full featured a library as Rx is, but Rx is kind of a reference implementation for the spec. So there aren't too many other libraries that actually implement it the same as a proposal. I shouldn't say spec; it's a proposal. There's a spec to the proposal, I suppose, but it's not written in stone yet because it hasn't passed a certain level in the TC39.
Yeah, currently I think it's at stage 1. I believe it's ready to move to stage 2, but it's not yet on the agenda of things.
Right. It's one of those things where it's not necessarily dead. Like it's kind of in a holding pattern while the TC39 is waiting to see what sort of implementer interest there is. So there's another proposal that I actually put together on behalf of Google for the WhatWig. So that's the one of the working groups around the DOM standards. And what that proposal is it's adding observable to the DOM as part of event target. So event target is the interface that has add event listener, remove event listener, and I think dispatch event are all part of that. And the idea was to add an on method so you could say on click and it would return an observable of clicks. So that would kind of get it into the DOM and also provide a more ergonomic way to deal with events from the DOM. And the Chrome team is all about it. There's been mild passing interest from the other browser implementers, but I think they all have too much on their plate to really consider it right now. So that again is another one that's kind of in a holding pattern. But as soon as I think some of the other browsers free up, they'll free up some time in their development schedule. They're going to come back and start looking at other proposals to pick up. And I know the Chrome team's pretty hot on this, so I would imagine that some of the other browser vendors like Edge or Safari might also be interested.
Very cool. So for right now, RxJS is the way to go if you want to do that stuff in the browser. But if you're interested, definitely keep an eye on the proposal. Well, I'll say the proposal, not the spec. So Ben, you mentioned like being a part of the Angular team and things like that. Like right now, if you Google RxJS, or if you search on Stack Overflow, you see a lot of Angular 2 questions. One thing that I just want to clear up right now is that is to ask the question: is RxJS a part of Angular, or is it an entirely separate thing?
It's an entirely separate project. It's just the only dependency that Angular has, is the best way to put it. Now that I'm on the Angular team, Igor and Mishko and Brad Green, they were all very, very concerned that other people would see RxJS as was I, as they'd see RxJS as like an Angular library, and it's just plainly not. Like there's, if you look at NPM download stats, you'll see that there's a lot more downloads of RxJS than there are of Angular. And for every download of Angular core, there's one download of RxJS because it's a dependency. So clearly people are using it for things other than Angular. And in fact, the majority of people are using it for things other than Angular.
And the other thing that really excited me is we usually have a mix in Rx Workshop of different people, whether they're using Angular or React or maybe something else. But the last Rx Workshop we did, it was all React except for 2 Angular people, and we were very pleasantly surprised.
Yeah, that's awesome. I know that I agree. Like especially early on, before I had Angular was my introduction to RxJS, so I remember seeing it there. It took me a little bit to be like, oh no, it's this whole other separate thing. Awesome. So a big thing about RxJS is, well, it is streams, and you can do things to those streams with these functions called operators. Can one of you explain what operators are, and maybe give a couple of very simple examples of how you would use operators, and also use them to compose potentially use them to compose multiple streams of data into a single one?
So operators are essentially, the idea behind operators is you can take one value type and perform some operation on it to make that same value type again. So for example, with an array, you can take an array and filter it into another array, or you can take an array and map it into a new array. And they work very much the same way in RxJS, where you can take an observable and filter it into a new observable, or take an observable and map it into a new observable. And there's a lot of different operators that you can use. So one example that would be a little bit different than array would be, for example, like debounce time or something like that, where you're actually dependent on the time at which values arrive that you decide whether or not to forward the value along. But there's a variety of other things. You can merge different observables together. That's an operator. You can concatenate observables end to end, just like you do with arrays, only it's happening over time. That's an operator. So operators are just ways to take an observable and you apply an operator to it to make a new observable.
And I think this is where a lot of people get really stuck with RxJS. They see the number of operators that Rx has and really just either don't know exactly which one to use, or they try to learn too many at a time. I can't tell you how many times we get asked questions like, wait, what's the difference between merge map and switch map? Or what's the difference between concat and concat all, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the way to best learn something like Rx is to just stick with a few, get really good at figuring out, what it does and how to implement it in your code. And then you can move on to other things. And Ben and I pair on a lot of things related to Rx. And a lot of times, I always love it when there's an operator that you've never used, Ben. That's my favorite.
Yeah, there's a few of those.
So with that, so we've mentioned a couple of the really common ones, like the big ones for me end up being map, which is just return a new value. Concat map, which is return a new observable, which will then return a new value. So a lot of those end up being pretty easy, but there are also quite a few that aren't as straightforward, but are nonetheless extremely useful. One of the ones that comes to mind for me anyway is one called share replay, where you can turn a cold observable into a hot observable, which hopefully we will get into exactly what that is in a little bit. Are there any operators that you think are underused or underutilized because they're either difficult to understand or even just because they solve a particular problem?
Well, there's that one operator that turns any observable into warm observables.
warm observables. Yeah, Tracy's playing off the fact that I always tell people not to call them hot and cold. It's an old terminology. So basically, it's either unicast or multicast. And what hot and cold tends to be about is whether or not. So whenever you subscribe to an observable, it generally creates the thing that's producing values at the moment you subscribe. And when it does that, then it's quote unquote cold. So there's no thing that's hot that's producing values for you. But if you subscribe to an observable where the thing producing values already exists, then that's a hot observable. So that means that there's already something active producing values. So for example, if you have a button in when you're on like a web page and you make an observable of click events from it, that's hot because the button already existed before you ever made the observable. So there's things like that. So Tracy's just pointing out that hot and cold are kind of a trigger for me, because you could have, so basically you have an observable that closes over the creation of a producer, because observables are just functions. So if you have a function that closes over the creation of something producing values, then it's cold. But if it closes over something that was created outside, then it's warm, or hot rather. Damn it! See, this is why it's bad. And then if it actually creates the thing producing values when you call it, then it's cold. But what happens if you have a function that not only creates a producer but closes over a producer? Then it's lukewarm or something, right? And there are examples of this. So that's why I try to steer clear of that sort of thing. But it's generally that it's multicast or unicast. So most observables, when you create them, are unicast, and then share and share replay actually make it multicast, which means that everybody that subscribes to observe the observable is subscribed to the same underlying observable one time. Like there's one subscription to that, and it's sharing it amongst many observers. Now, share replay, what it does is it says, not only am I going to share my subscription with everybody else that subscribes, but when they first subscribe, I'm going to give them whatever values I've already received. So it's like a caching mechanism as well. I can't say that I can think of any operators that are kind of underused. I feel like concat map is frequently underused in favor of switch map, which can cause weird bugs sometimes. But yeah, overall, I think that like it's just a general lack of understanding with some of the operators.
Okay. I will never call them hot or cold observables ever again.
Yeah, Danny. Why you got to cause trouble?
You're ruining Tracy's fun because she knows it's a trigger of mine. So.
Well, it's funny because, Ben, I remember when you first rewrote the library, you were calling pipeable operators lettable operators.
Yeah.
And now it's no.
Everybody loved that.
They're pipeable, not lettable. but you told us it was
Oh
lettable.
boy. I did. That's not good. Just let that go.
Naming things is hard. Let us all admit to the fact that this is a
Naming
truth.
is an art, not a science.
Yeah. Open source is hard too. You say the wrong thing and it gets popularized very quickly, and you're like, oh no, wait, I didn't really mean it.
And this project as a whole has grown a lot rather quickly, would you say, Ben?
Yeah, it's very strange. So I remember like 3 or 4 years ago being able to look at the NPM downloads and being like, oh, look, 10 downloads this week, and then trying to guess who it was that downloaded. Like I could actually do that. And this was, when it was really alpha or beta software. And now, see, last month, I think I definitely know last month we were up over 7 million downloads on NPM, and week to week now it's up to like more than 2 million downloads per week. So it's catching up to React in terms of downloads, which is very strange. There's this been this very rapid uptick in how many people are using it over the last 2 or 3 months.
Dealing with a project growth of that size, I mean, it must, you talk about the notion of you say one thing and all of a sudden it now is stamped into sort of the historical, this was the way you said you were going to do it. I mean, is that a continuing problem? Because we talk to a lot of open source developers on the show, obviously, and I'm always curious because I think it's very difficult to sort of thread the needle when you're trying to basically design in the open and you're trying to get community feedback. But at the same time, you have to make decisions that, are all of a sudden now affect not 10 people, but, millions. Do you find that easier to do now as opposed to when it got big initially? Or, is it still that always constant juggling act you end up having to do?
I think it's scary. I mean, it's, obviously I have my friends in the Angular team are very close friends of mine. And I remember when they decided that they needed to rewrite Angular. I mean, just frankly, they needed to, because there was some design flaws they needed to work their way out of. And I remember when they announced Angular 2 and the backlash that they received, when, if they had just named it something different, it probably would have been fine. Like people wouldn't have cared, right? And it's, I don't know, it's scary when you're dealing with that many people. And the other thing that, I mean, honestly, the thing that keeps me up at night more than that is knowing that like I could make a mistake and deploy it and break builds for thousands of people and like ruin their mornings when they get in. And it's just an innocent mistake on my fault. But we try to, we try to have obviously safeguards around that with continuous integration and things like that. But it still can happen, and that's a little intimidating. There was Tracy. Should I tell them about Smushgate? No. Yes.
Yes, you should, because it's hilarious.
So
this podcast is just going to be renamed to things that Ben shouldn't have done.
I like it.
Oh God, we could just change the name of the library to that, I suppose. But so for April Fools, my friend Jay Phelps and I decided that we were going to change the names of all the merge operators to smush. So instead of like merge map, it would be smush map, and instead of merge all, it would be smush all, and etc. And we did so, and I published it. And this was whenever RxJS 6 was still beta. It was newly beta. I'm sorry, no, it was newly release candidate. And so when I published it as RxJS 6.0.0-smush.1. And little did I know, actually, Igor Minar of the Angular team is the only person that I knew that even knew this. Everybody else seemed to think that doing a dash some text here dot whatever was like a namespacing thing. It's actually not. It actually, all semantic versioning goes alphanumeric. So smush is firmly after release candidate. So anyone that had installed even RxJS version 6 alpha with a caret was going to get, all the betas, and then they get all the release candidates, and then via semantic versioning, now they get Smush. And so basically I deployed something as a joke that broke a whole bunch of people's builds. And I realized it after Igor pointed out, I realized it within like 45 minutes of publishing it. And I went to unpublish it because there's a 45-minute window to unpublish things, but I can't because certain libraries on NPM are treated as special in that they rapidly get a lot of dependencies, and therefore they can never be unpublished. So I ended up having to publish all of my future release candidates with semvers that were higher than Smush, right? So then it was like RxJS, was it RxJS 6.0.0 tactical-RC2, right? Like I kept having to add these different like tactical, turbo, and umbrella, whatever words I put in there to keep it in alphabetical order. And it was really embarrassing. And it's, of course, it's still there in the history, and I will never, ever do that again.
That is amazing. Because I remember seeing that, because we've talked about Smushgate on the show before. I remember seeing that in the RxJS, like in the changelog. I had no idea that it would cause that problem and actually become a potential issue. That's just pretty funny, actually.
Yeah.
You learn something new every day in a very large scale way.
Right. It's still, I still feel bad about that.
I wouldn't. It was funny. It's a nice story to tell at the very least.
And you shouldn't peg your stuff to RCs, is all I'm saying. Like,
who's really at fault?
Hey, you know what? It's going to be a theological question for the ages, Danny. I think we can all agree on that, or not.
Okay, so one thing that I wanted to make sure that we got to is that anybody that's looked at, so we've already talked about unicast and multicast observables at this point. Most people, when you start messing with RxJS, you end up running into three main classes: observable, subject, and behavior subject. And there are there are others, but those seem to be the three main ones. Can you kind of the same as the operator's question, can you kind of describe the difference between those three and give, when one should be used over the other?
So then the three, to be clear, are observable, subject, and behavior subject?
Yes, I meant to say that.
All right. So observable is the basic type. That's it's the other two effectively inherit from observable, but or the other two are observables really. So an observable is basically at its root a function that when you subscribe to it, it basically calls this internal function, taking your three callbacks or your observer or whatever you pass to subscribe, wrapping it in what's called a subscriber for safety, and then passing it to the body of this function to do things like create something that produces data and tie it to this subscriber that then pumps values to your callbacks or your observer or whatever you passed in, and then returns some sort of teardown semantic. So that's what observables are about. So all three of them are observables because they all behave as observables and they're all implemented as observables and so on. Now, subjects and behavior subjects are basically the same thing. And I'll just talk about subjects first. Subjects are not only an observable, but they're also an observer. And an observer is this interface that has a next method, an error method, and a complete method on it. And you can subscribe to an observable with an observer. So this subject is both an observer and an observable. And a subject is effectively the gang of four observer pattern has two things in it. It has a subject and it has, I believe it's actually just called an observer in there. And what subjects do in the gang of four pattern is subjects have an add observer and remove observer method on them. And when you call add observer, you pass an observer to it. and it adds it to this internal list of observers, such that when you notify the subject, it calls notify on all of the observers in the list. Now, if you apply this same logic to Rx, it's the same thing, where a subject, you can subscribe to it with an observer. It adds it to an internal list of observers. And then whenever you call next on it, it calls next on all those observers it's got in its list. And same for error and complete. So subject is effectively a pass-through method to create a multicasting scenario. So that's what a subject is. There's no more magic to it than that, really. Behavior subject is the same as a subject, but it caches the previous value. So new subscribers will get the previous value immediately and not have to wait for another value to be pumped through the subject. So the use cases for these things are, well, observables you can use in pretty much any scenario you want, and they're generally unicast. Subjects, the primary use case for subjects is really to create a multicast observable from another observable, but you can use them for things like in Angular or React. You can use them to imperatively create an observable where you have, here's a subject, I want an observable, so here's a subject, and I'm going to, whenever someone clicks a button, call next on my subject, and now I have an observable of button clicks, for example. So that's a use case for subject. So behavior subjects are really about the idea of, like, if you have something that, let's say something where you're getting a value once every 10 seconds, right? You wouldn't want your user to subscribe to this observable and then have to sit there and wait for a full 10 seconds before they get a value. That's really bad UX. So you might use a behavior subject, and then whenever the user subscribes to it, they immediately get whatever the previous value was that behavior subject got, and then they get every value afterwards. So that's kind of the use case for that.
Awesome. So would it be fair to think of a subject kind of like an event bus or something like that, or an example use case?
Yeah, I mean, that is an example use case. Behavior subjects and subjects get used as event buses a lot. Whenever you're writing like a Redux style pattern, you can say, I've got this subject or this, I usually do a behavior subject that is like my actions, right? So you can dispatch actions through this subject, and then you then take that and scan it into some reducer that is effectively your reducers like you'd have in Redux.
Cool. So, so Tracy, one of the reasons I'm excited to have you on the show is that, especially because you're very involved in the documentation, correct?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So for everything that we've already talked about today, there's a lot in there. There's a lot to unpack. There's just there are a lot of different operators. There are a lot of different concepts that you need to grasp, that you need to try to wrap your head around. So how does that influence documentation, and then walk through a little bit what the present of the RxJS documentation is and where you guys are trying to get?
Yeah, so the documentation is a really good way for anybody who just wants to get into open source. It's a great place for anybody to start, right? You like a repo or you like a project, and if you just start helping with the docs, you'll probably eventually end up being on the core team. If you can behave right. So it's almost like maybe it's kind of like an open source internship or something. But what I did, I don't even remember when, but maybe about a year ago or so, was decide that nobody else was going to do the docs unless I took charge. So I decided that I was going to help lead the docs initiative. So all I did was spin up an Angular repo and stuck Angular material in it and said, have at it, and created a bunch of issues. And then found people who were already excited, like Brian Tronconi, for example, who does learn RxJS.io, who wanted to contribute, started having meetings on it. And Ben was very supportive and just saying, okay, Tracy, have at it. So that was nice. And, what ended up happening is we created these sort of temporary docs in which we were mainly focused on, a lot of the operators maybe don't have enough descriptions or don't have real world examples or different things like that. Now what's happened and what you would currently see on the documentation site is we needed to get the API docs fixed. And we basically worked with the Angular team to use Jenny, which is Angular's way of generating the API docs. And so we've been able to release those. And we're sort of going through this migration now of, okay, now we have the new API docs. And now what we need to do is migrate all that great information that all these contributors contributed to the sort of like description-ish docs and stick it on over. So, I think Angular had this, and I'm pretty sure React has had this too, but you have the newest router and then the newest new router. So this is kind of like you have the new docs and then the newest docs. And anyways, but it's a great project, and I think one of the interesting things when you look at documentation. So if you look at Angular docs and you look at React documentation, React is very much more API focused documentation, right? Very clear, succinct. It seems like I know that they've been trying to get like a little bit more how-to-ish. But then when you look at the Angular docs, it's very how-to, very step-by-step type deal. So Ben and I always go back and forth on, what should the RxJS docs look like? And I always remind him that, people who are learning the docs or learning RxJS really need more words than just what this API does to really be able to grok it.
Docs are always a real fine line, aren't they? Like it's very difficult when you have such a wide-ranging project that has so many users from a developer perspective, where you're trying to bring new people into the fold as quickly as you can so that they can be productive and feel that success early. And yet you still need documentation that your advanced users, your long-term developers can sort of grok very quickly from a perspective of, I need to get work done right now against this thing I already know, but this is a new feature and I need this thing now. I mean, how do you make that decision? I mean, there's so many documentation these days can't really be a secondary thought anymore. For a long time, I always felt that was kind of the case because, as someone who codes, like I enjoy coding, but my documentation skills could always probably use a level up here and there. Do you find that it's difficult to do? Do you see people who, that are having trouble in that scenario? I mean, that must be very difficult to manage overall.
I think because Ben and other people on the core team are so familiar with Rx, they assume you only need to know so much. So it's really important to get different people like myself, for example, or Jen Luker, who doesn't do any Angular or Rx, she doesn't do Angular, but that's not related to the RxJS docs. But let's say it was a little bit harder for her to contribute code. But getting different perspectives, because a great example is, Ben and Jay, who, have been part of RxJS core for so long, they've taught me RxJS. So as they were teaching me Rx, I would ask them, okay, where do I find this in the docs? And, Jay's response before has been, oh, I just look at the source code, right? So, what do you do, right? So one thing we're trying to do with the docs, the new docs, is make it accessible to beginners so that it's not such a big hurdle to actually get involved and get started.
Yeah, anytime you can reach out to beginners, I think is, it does take a special sort of touch. I think it can be very hard when, because I'm as you mentioned, right? I wonder how that works. I will just go look at the code. Like that's usually my de facto even before I get to a lot of documentation, because I've been burned on documentation in the past, even from very large platforms that should be able to, that are corporate backed. Like a lot of times you can't trust the documentation that's placed there. These days, though, I've started to see a lot of projects, Angular, your own documentation, Rx, the Polymer project, things like that, where the documentation is very clear and succinct and accessible, as opposed to a lot of documentation which, frankly, was not, which always left you falling back into a code base that you didn't even necessarily understand. in a lot of cases. And that's unfortunate for developers who are just trying to get work done. Because a lot of times when we look at projects or platforms or APIs or libs, at the end of the day, it's somebody on the downstream who's trying to just do their job, which sometimes I think is forgotten. And it's nice to see the documentation you guys have been producing. It's quite lovely. And as someone who doesn't use Rx a lot, like, I can follow along and be very productive very quickly.
That's great. I'm happy to hear that.
I'm very happy to hear that. The docs are probably the single highest priority for RxJS right now. So any and all contribution around that is generally looked at very quickly and pretty much fast-tracked through because it's just so important. There's other work being done for the future of RxJS involving making things a lot smaller. There's a whole experimental branch that is doing some really great things based off of another library that Andre Staltz wrote called Callbags, but it's similar but different, and that's kind of fun to go look at. But that stuff is as an aside to the important work that's going on around documentation, because as I see that npm download like line going steadily up at like a 20-degree angle, it's concerning to me that our docs aren't really in a great place yet, but they're getting so much better. They're 1,000 times better than they were. But I really want to make sure that all these new people that are using the library are able to find good documentation and good examples. And so if there's anybody out there that's listening that thinks, oh, I'd like to contribute to open source, let me tell you, I am very, very happy to review your documentation contributions and help you get some contributions in that way, because it's a big deal.
Can we just share Natalie's story really quickly? So Natalie, it was her first contribution to the documentation. Her first open source contribution was actually to the docs. And of course, being a female, I was like, guys, review her PR immediately. Because, we really want to encourage diversity in open source, right, in a friendly environment. Then Natalie ended up going to Rx Workshop a few months later. And then what has she been, like the number 12 contributor now to
yeah,
RxJS
definitely.
core?
If you look in just the last, if you just look in recent history, she's probably closer to in the top 10, because you can go and you can look at, here's the contributors, and you can just kind of swipe that graph and say, well, what about in the last couple months? Yeah, she's number 4 if you narrow it down to the last like 3 months or so. She's the number 4 contributor to the library. So really, really happy that she's been contributing as much as she has. So it's great to see her around.
Yeah, that's outstanding. It's always awesome to hear good stories like that in the open source community. Sometimes there can be a lot of, even negative stuff around it. So I'm very happy for her, and I'm just happy that we can share that story with more people. That's awesome. So we are about to run out of time. So real quick, Tracy and Ben, can you both say, maybe some of the things that are upcoming? Is there anything that we missed before we let you and our listeners go?
I can't think of anything that we missed in this conversation. If anyone wants to kind of see what the future of RxJS looks like, they can go and they can look at the experimental branch. That's kind of what I'm personally excited about. Just recently, I did an experiment where I took a brand new Angular app that was built with the current production version of the Angular CLI, and I swapped out RxJS 6 for this RxJS Next version that sits in the experimental branch. And the RxJS footprint in the production build went from 17K down to 7K. So that's a really big deal. It's more than 50% smaller than it was before. And that's not even including, once we have Angular Ivy out from the Angular team, we're going to see the size of Angular apps is going to be drastically reduced. So like a Hello World wouldn't even have RxJS in it at all, most likely. And then a standard app, if you had a standard app and it was a 40K app, well, this new version of Rx is probably going to take 10K additional out of that. So I'm really, really excited about that. personally. It's been some big excitement for me over the last few weeks. But again, it's future stuff. It's probably not terribly concerning for developers worried about what they're going to do tomorrow, but it is interesting at the very least.
I think all
That sounds fantastic.
library authors are excited about the rewrites that they're currently working on, because after they're done with one rewrite, they're always moving on to the next rewrite. So, but on the this.dot side, we have a few awesome events coming up. Like, we just finished Angular Contributor Days and Vue Contributor Days, and we are going to be doing Browser Contributor Days as well. So these are great 4-hour events that you can attend for free online if you want to just have amazing discussions with different library authors related to the different frameworks or libraries. They're also all recorded online, so if you want to check them out, you can go to the this.media YouTube and find the pre-recorded and just figure out what's going on in your different technologies.
Fantastic. So if people want to find you both online and chit chat and or things, where should they find you?
You can find me on Twitter at LadyLeet.
And you can find me on Twitter just by messaging Tracy. Pretty much. No, I'm at Ben Lesh on Twitter. But seriously, message Tracy if you can't get a hold of me, because she can always get a hold of me.
It's terrible, but true.
Well, we'd like to thank you both for coming on the show today. It was great to have you.
Thanks for having us. It's been a lot of fun.
Yes, please come back and tell us more wonderful RxJS things and Angular things and whatnot. We'd love to have you back. Danny, anything we missed before we wrap up here on episode number 163?
Sounds like if you want to start contributing to open source, get in touch with Tracy and look at the docs.
Yes, please do that.
Fantastic. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this has been episode number 163 of the Web Platform Podcast. Today, we've talked about RxJS and a wide range of awesome things. We hope that you join us next week when we talk more things web platform, more things developer, more things to hopefully make your world a little bit easier. Thank you so much and have a wonderful rest of your week.
Bye, everybody.